Exactly 1 month into Donald Trump's trial, there is new polling that finds for the first time the majority of Americans believe the former president is guilty. In the latest Yahoo News YouGov national poll, 52% of adults say Trump did indeed falsify business records to conceal hush money payments to a porn star. That is up 4 points from last month and up 7 points from when the charges were filed last year. If convicted, 51% would approve of Trump serving prison time, while 36% would be against putting him behind bars.
Willie, look at that. 51% would support Donald Trump. So I guess this isn't a far left-wing conspiracy.
No, that's a majority of Americans.
Yeah, that would be. Wait, again, I went to Alabama. 51. That's a majority.
Yeah,
right.
Once you get to 51.
Yes.
Okay.
Joyce confirms.
Okay.
As
Fantastic.
for the political ramifications, the poll shows Trump and President Joe Biden tied at 45% in this year's election among registered voters. But when asked who they would support if convicted, if Trump is convicted
that's not close.
in the hush money case, Biden takes a 7-point lead, 46 to 39%. So can I look at some other polling?
Yeah,
now?
why not?
The latest Morning Consult tracking poll over 10,000 registered voters finds 44% for Trump and 43% for Biden. That's within the poll's margin of error.
It's not 12 points. It's a tie. Okay.
And separate new polling of registered voters finds President Joe Biden leading Donald Trump in this survey from the New York Times and Ipsos. Biden is up 4 points, 47 to 43%. We should note, though, that the margin of error is plus or minus 6% for the poll.
So I get to say it's fascinating, Willie, and we'll get into this. The New York Times ran a few polls. They ran the New York Times Siena poll, which they roll off. It's a series, 15, 16, 17 stories that make people run around Manhattan with their hair on fire and Washington with their hair on fire. At the same, put this New York Times Ipsos poll.
The Ipsos.
Put it back.
Okay.
Run at the same time by the New York Times. Biden's ahead by 4 points nationally. 4 points nationally. Not even an article about it. Anyway.
As for that New York Times Philadelphia Inquirer Siena College polling of 6 key battleground states that came out Monday morning, there was a lot of reaction to that. As we know, some of the most trusted pollsters in the country are calling into question the methodology and results.
You think?
The CEO of the Nevada Independent, John Ralston, calls Trump having a 13-point lead in the state, quote, bizarre, adding that nothing remotely similar has been seen in the state in decades. The founder of UVA's Center for Politics, Larry Sabato, says he laughed after seeing the Nevada numbers and recommends others do the same. National political reporter at The Bulwark, Mark Caputo, also calls the Nevada poll, quote, a total outlier. Meanwhile, the director of polling at Harvard's Institute of Politics, John Della Volpe, is raising questions about how Biden could be losing the youth vote by 27 points in Michigan while winning it by 24 points in Wisconsin.
A million monkeys with a million
I think there are a lot of
cell phones
here.
making calls as pollsters. Okay. That's how you do it.
Finally, the New Republic's Greg Sargent expressed dismay at the survey's methodology. This is important, which shows 20% of the likely voters polled either didn't vote in the last 2 midterms.
Wait a second. Wait a second.
Vote.
They're likely voters,
but they did not vote.
The 20% of what the New York Times is calling likely voters.
So let me finish.
Didn't vote in the last general election or the last two midterms,
and didn't vote in the last general election or the last 2 midterms, or they have never voted at all.
But wait, John Heilman, there's more. And by the way, people calling and going, oh, this is just a reaction to one poll. No, you can go back. You can look at the tape. We do this every time the New York Times Siena poll comes out. It's always an outlier. And the New York Times always gets 15 or 16 articles out of them that everybody rushes to because it says Earth ends at 5 o'clock. Go hit link at New York Times 15 times, and they keep writing articles about it. There are, and NPR has found some of these voters that said, well, I voted for Biden before, and they said, but wait, this guy, we checked the voting rolls. He's never voted. Other news organizations have like 3, 4 more examples, not just of people in the surveys, but people the New York Times quoted in their articles of, well, here's one of many people that we interviewed that said he's disillusioned and is going to vote for Trump. No record of them voting.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know,
are you feeling something?
Well, I'm feeling that there's
say?
I think sometimes, as a general matter, there's maybe a little bit of an over-reliance on voters telling the truth about things in general. Hate to say it. Reporters find this occasionally that reporters lie. Here's what I'd say about this poll. If I were to ask you this question, Joe, do you know anybody on either side who doesn't think that it's the case that of the battleground states that Joe Biden is stronger in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin than he is in Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia?
It sounds about right. I've seen some polls that show that George is very close. Greg Bluestein actually had an article that also says the Siena poll is wildly off.
I'm not saying it's not close. I'm not going to carry water for the New York Times or for the methodology of this poll. I'll keep going back to a thing that I try to say every time we talk about these things, which is that I'm really interested, and I know you know this, is like, what are the polls telling us directionally about the race?
I understand. There's a difference, though, with the New York Times Siena poll, and you know this. It's given disproportionate impact. This year, this cycle, it is skewed wildly in Donald Trump's direction. Hold on. And the New York Times feasts on it with clickbait stories like a dozen at a time.
And what I'm trying to focus on is what I think people should pay attention to.
But what I'm trying to focus on is the New York Times right now is actively shaping the election cycles, where this poll comes out on a Sunday and on Monday people go, oh, and I heard it. And I'm sitting there going, oh, don't be so stupid. That's why we're doing this.
So
hold on a second. Hold on. What I hear is after these Siena polls come out, every time New York Times poll says, oh, well, everything that Joe Biden's done since the State of the Union address, all this money that he's put out, all of the campaigning is for naught. No, it's not. No, it's not. There's one poll that's wildly skewed every time. Okay. And it does shape, if it's a New York Times poll versus a Morning Consult poll, and the New York Times then amplifies it 15, 16, 17 times, it warps reality. And everybody responds to that in the media and in the political world.
So all I'd say about this is that I agree with you that the problem to me, unless you want to suggest you think there's a conspiracy at the Times about this, which
their methodology is bizarre.
Well, but you're talking about
Larry Sabato said this. Walston said this.
Joe, you're saying something more than that, though. You're saying the New York Times is systematically putting these polls out in a way to try to amplify them to drive the news cycle.
Yes. I am saying that.
And I'm saying I'd like to know. I'm curious. As someone who I understands your level of sophistication about reading the media, why you think that's true. What I'm trying to say is, I agree with you. The best bulwark against any polls, outliers, or anything else for people who are actually consumers of this information is to not let any given news outlet or any given poll shape your perception of the race unduly.
But John, that's not realistic, and I'll tell you why it's not realistic. Because, and I'll say to you, because I know people come up to you after every New York Times Siena poll comes out. It completely changes the political battlefield out there for about a week and a half. It distorts the questions that are asked of the White House. It distorts the questions that are asked of Donald Trump. It distorts all of the opinion. It distorts everything. And that keeps happening every month when this comes out. And then finally, about 2 weeks later, after the residue of the New York Times Siena poll leaves, people go, oh, I think Joe Biden's on a winning streak. And then 2 weeks later, it comes out again, and it's garbage. It's an outlier. And yes, the New York Times, when they have all of these experts questioning the methodology, when they're calling like 20% of the people, likely voters who have never voted before or didn't vote in the last 2 primaries, when they're even quoting people who said they're switching their vote from Joe Biden, who have never voted before? I'm sorry. The New York Times has to know what they're doing.